Dear speakers, dear participants, welcome to this webinar in partnership with the ICC on business and human rights. Before to start, let me remind you the good practices of this webinar. Participants, your micro and camera are turned off by default. And for the speakers only, please turn off your micro when you're not talking. The webinar is recorded and the replay will be sent to you after the event. If you have any questions, please ask them in the Q&A box. We will answer them at the end of the webinar. And if you wish to speak, please raise your hand and we will give you the floor as soon as possible. I will now give the floor to Vincent Subilia, General Director of the CCIG.
Well, I hope you can see me all. A very warm good afternoon to you all, dear participants and members of the Geneva Chamber of Commerce. I am delighted to welcome you, albeit digitally on my screen, to just voice a short note of introduction to say how thrilled we are to pursue this new edition of the ICC-CCIG Series in partnership with ICC Switzerland. As I'm sure you know, the Geneva Chamber of Commerce has been advocating the voice of the Geneva business community for over 150 years to the benefits of its 2,400 corporate members. And Geneva, which is often described as the capital or the cradle of human rights, plays a key role, and human rights are also enshrined and embedded in the DNA of the chambers through our sustainable development agenda. So it came very naturally that we would partner with the ICC, especially at the occasion of this landmark anniversary of the unanimous endorsement by the Human Rights Council of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So this event comes very timely, just in the wake of the milestone summit between President Biden and Putin, which really also reflected and echoed and strengthened, if I may, the role of Geneva as a capital of peace. And I'm really honored to welcome on this panel leading speakers from the UN, with the chair of the working group on human rights, Mr. Pesquet, but also Isabelle Gatica, the well-known co-founder of and director of the International Film Festival and Forum on Human Rights, and additionally, Dorothée Beaumont-Poli, professor at the University of Geneva, which set up its Business and Human Rights Center to the advisory board of which I am humbly taking part, not leaving aside the corporate voice coming from Peter Nestor, head of human rights at Novartis. And in this, you will have the pleasure to listen to our co-host, Crispin Conroy, who is the ambassador and the representative director of the ICC in Geneva, located at the Chamber of Commerce within the House of Economy, right in the center of Geneva. So to all of you, again, thank you for your trust in the Chamber, and thank you for taking an active part into this webinar. We look forward to further CCIG ICC series and to welcome you physically now that we're resuming with some sense of normality. But in the meantime, let's focus on key issues and human rights, which are really at the center of what we all fight for. And with this, I'll give the word to Thomas Fletcher, Secretary General of ICC Switzerland. And I thank my colleague Beatrice Ojeda, who shall be our MC, Master of Ceremony for tonight. I wish you a very fruitful seminar. Myself sitting tonight at the Geneva Parliament, where we shall be discussing also sensitive issue. I wish you a fruitful event and look forward to seeing you all. Bel été, thank you, merci et à bientôt. Bye bye.
Thank you, my dear Vincent, my friend. ICC Switzerland is very proud to co-host tonight's event for two reasons. One is it's a continuation of our close cooperation with the Geneva Chamber of Commerce, the Geneva with whom we have created and conduct the Geneva Business Dialogues, where we want to bring business people, diplomatic people, Geneva people together and to exchange views on important issues. We hope we will be able soon to resume to conduct these meetings physically, but in the meantime, we do it as webinars. And I'm really looking forward to a continued cooperation with the Geneva Chamber, not the last in view of the World Chambers Congress that will take place in 2023 in Geneva, where all ICC, the whole ICC, the whole World Business Organization will come to Geneva. Second reason why I'm really pleased to being part of tonight is, of course, the topic. Business and human rights is at the core of the ICC DNA. In fact, as of the creation of ICC, the founders of ICC 100 years ago called themselves merchants of peace at the end of the Great War. And therefore, human rights and inclusiveness is really core to ICC as a matter of principle, beyond being the business voice in the global community. Our today's or nowadays slogan, making business work for everyone, everywhere, every day, touches also to this inclusiveness. And such inclusiveness cannot happen without respecting human rights, although there are big challenges around the globe. There are big challenges for companies. There are big challenges for all the other actors. ICC has, when restructuring its activities, its policy activities 3 years ago, has created a own knowledge hub touching to the issues of sustainability, inclusiveness, and human rights. This marks internally our conviction of the importance of this subject. But we have been following the discussions already years before, when the first discussions in the UN in the UN level started. I'm pretty sure Crispin will come back on this in more detail. So I will end my introduction, my welcome, and I'm really curious to the following discussions with you all. Many thanks, and looking forward to a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pletcher, for this introduction. We'll now give the floor to Mr. Dante Pesce. Mr. Pesce is the founder and executive director of the Vincula Center for Social Responsibility and Sustainable Development at the Catholic University of Valparaiso, Chile. From there, he's working in 14 Latin American countries in capacity building and advisory services related to sustainability and responsible business practices, including business and human rights. We are receiving him tonight in his capacity of chair of the UN Working Group on the issue of human rights and business enterprises. Mr. Pesce, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually in Geneva, surprisingly. I don't live here, but after 15 months, we got the okay to come for an in-person meeting. Another tiny correction. I was chair until yesterday. And today I'm just member of the working group because we rotate every 6 months, and I finished my turn yesterday. But I had the occasion to lead the process of evaluating the first 10 years of implementation of the guiding principles and to present our findings to the Human Rights Council, including civil society and many other organizations from the private sector and business, etc. And I will share with you the key findings, but mostly the way forward, the vision that we have into the future, and what is the indispensable role that industry associations have to play, the ones that represent the mainstream of business, to normalize a narrative and to normalize practices. And to normalize practices everywhere, at the headquarters, at the subsidiary, at the supply chain, etc. Because we have a full world where we need to have a level playing field regarding business and human rights and respect for human rights by business. And of course, we have a long way to go on that regard, and I will signal some elements around that. After 10 years of the unanimous endorsement of the guiding principles on business and human rights, we conducted a one-year evaluation process. Some data about that: more than 200 written submissions, some of them from global business, global unions, global indigenous people, and of course, a wide range of universities, civil society, governments, the European Union, coalitions of all kinds, etc. More than 200. That is massive. And that shows that there's a lot of people paying attention to this agenda, and they are willing to invest their time, their energy, and their hopes, their dreams as well into this process. The other, and that's very important. The other thing is that we conducted more than 30 ad hoc consultations, plus the participation in more than 40 consultations where we were invited. All continents, all stakeholders, part of this process. So it was a massive process to hear, to listen, and to capture from what, let's say, creates hope and expectations, but also what is not working that well, or definitely is not working at all in the views of many. What do we have after this one-year evaluation? Well, we have a report with a short version of 4 pages, so anyone can read it. And what does it say? Well, it does say, the main conclusion is that we have a half full, half empty glass story. A half full, mostly by big business, industry associations and governments that consider that this journey is overall a positive journey where we are making important level of progress and where the evidence is supporting that progress. And at the same time, we have a half-empty story. And the half-empty comes from unions, civil society, indigenous people, and small and medium-sized enterprises, human rights defenders, not only in the global south, certainly in the global south, but not only in the global south. But the most important thing here is that we are discussing around the same glass, half empty, half full, but the same framework. A same framework that is unanimously accepted as a good framework, a framework that is showing that progress is possible, that we can actually work together around a common understanding of challenges and a common understanding of solutions, or at least the approach to solutions. So that's the good news. Of course, we have a lot of pending issues, SMEs, the informal economy, the defenders that I mentioned before, but I will just to mention some of the key obstacles that we face. Lack of policy coherence, mostly from our governments at national level and at global level. The lack of connection, for example, with WTO and trade and commerce, with the climate change agenda, with the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, with integrity and the Convention on Anti-Corruption of the OECD, on peace and prosperity, peace building, peacekeeping. So on all of those fronts and many others, we have room for improvement. Nevertheless, we do have some areas where we are quite well connected. ILO more and more, OECD up and down. So we're not hopeless, but we have an issue of policy coherence. We interact with the ministers that have, in general, less power at the level of our governments, and we do not interact much with the ministers, the money ministers, which tend to be the powerful ministers. That is changing in some countries, say recently Germany, but overall, that is something that we're missing. With business, related with business, developing business models that do not undermine human rights. For example, in the context of supply chain, purchasing practices, and the digital economy. What we observe is room for improvement there, or significant room for improvement, depends who you ask. And also sometimes the double lobbying, one positive hand advocating for good reasons and for good causes, and at the same time advocating to a certain extent for the opposite causes, undermining the progress that we're making in many aspects. This is the area of the corporate capture of the state, or the regulatory capture of the state, which happens in many parts of the world with weak governance and with high level of corruption. Of course, this is a major problem. Overcoming silos agenda, notably I mentioned already the SDGs and climate change. The need for better corporate human rights performance data, including better disclosure to facilitate accountability. We know very little. We know a bit about headquarters. When you double click into subsidiary, supply chain, business relationships, we know very little. And therefore there's a huge room for improvement and transparency. And of course that brings attached accountability. There's also a need to track state implementation more systematically. We don't really keep our governments accountable to their commitments and obligations. We have very little data, and we have very little capacity to actually monitor the fulfillment of obligations regarding Pillar 1 and Pillar 3 of the states, etc. We have a huge capacity gap. In 2011, Professor Raghi proposed a capacity building trust fund to build the infrastructure around the world and to strengthen the capacity to deliver the implementation of the guiding principles, and for business and governments to have counterparts in civil society, unions, indigenous, etc. That did not happen. And that, of course, explains why there are significant levels of frustration and hope, but frustration for the most part in so many places around the world. This is something that, of course, we want to build and develop this trust fund and make means for capacity building. Also on human rights institutions, SMEs in general missing out of this conversation, so civil society, communities, etc. And in this last decade has underscored the point made regarding the guiding principles in terms of pushing and advocating for a smart mix between mandatory and voluntary measures. 10 years ago, almost 100% was voluntary measures, soft law for almost 100%. Today, we're moving into a smart mix. In Western Europe, including Switzerland, more mandatory measures are on their way. Certainly, the rest of the world, not yet. And the rest of the world counts for 94% of the population, which is remaining for the much more part in soft law. But this is a trend that we see that it will be moving into more hard law, let's say, solutions. And the EU is actually planning, and we're having a conversation with them about a global level playing field push regarding business and human rights. So to finish, my last point, when we look into the next 10 years, and we will start, actually we started today, the process to elaborate the roadmap for the next decade of implementation. We will finalize that process the 31st of October. We will launch that roadmap in our 10th anniversary in the last few days of November, 1st of December. But in short, one word: implementation. Implementation. That is what is missing for the most part. Not that we don't have any implementation, but we have been moving in an incremental pace, and we need to move into exponential. and exponential to reach everywhere in the world. So we need implementation with effectiveness, with evidence, with data, with accountability, with an exponential approach, as I mentioned. And we have, and that's the role for industry associations, we need to find room to have difficult conversations on elements, on issues, and on challenges that are in some occasions embarrassing, difficult to have. How to talk about corruption, for example, how to talk about legacy, historic wrongdoing, discrimination, and many other elements that was part of normal business practice, because it was, we were blind and we didn't even care about, for example, the environment. And when we look backwards, we say so much wrongdoing. Sure, but that's wrongdoing needs to be discussed somewhere, and we need to look into the future after solutions, but of course not avoiding the difficult conversations. And that is a very clear role for industry associations to help in this process that we have ahead of us, in which we have created a coalition of, let's say, a big coalition of all kinds of institutions and all stakeholders behind the guiding principles implementation. Then we have a great opportunity to actually move from incremental to exponential if we actually all work together, aligning ourselves to common goals and objectives, and that is what we have ahead of us. So again, thank you for the invitation. You're absolutely welcome, as always have been, to engage with us and to help us find solutions together to the great, let's say, dilemmas and the great challenges that we face as humanity everywhere in the world, different levels, but nevertheless, are common challenges. Thank you again very much.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Pesquet, for these very clear remarks. We'll have a time for questions and answers at the end of the webinar. So participants, you may already write your questions if you have some in the Q&A box, which you see below your screen. We will now hear Mr. Crispin Conroy, who is the Representative Director in Geneva of the International Chamber of Commerce and ICC's Permanent Observer to the United Nations in Geneva, who will talk about the ICC's commitment for the next decade of implementation. Crispin, the word is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Beatrice. Is the sound all right? We had some challenges in the test, but it's okay now. Good, thank you. So look, thank you, Beatrice, and also thank you to Vincent, to Thomas for your opening remarks, and also to both of you for your ongoing support for the ICC Geneva office, and to me personally in my role as ICC Representative Director. It's a great pleasure to participate in this second of our ICC-CCIG series on business and human rights. As many of you all know, the first was on trade and environmental sustainability in the WTO, and the next one will be on the priorities for the next ministerial conference of WTO MC12 later this year. So I think we've picked three pretty interesting topics for the series. So I'm looking forward to the next one. Also, I want to pay tribute to my friend and colleague Dante Pesce, who has been leading the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and as he mentioned, has just completed his time as chair. And he's also been leading, as he mentioned, the group's UNGP 10-year plus project, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative on the first 10 years of implementation and a roadmap for the next decade. Dante, your engagement with all stakeholders on this project will no doubt be a key to its success. And thank you so much, excuse me, for working so closely with ICC and with me, and also being so open to all stakeholders, especially and including business. It's also to be a great pleasure for me to be on a panel again with Dorothée. ICC with Doro and the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development have partnered for another series of seminars on business and human rights, the last of which a month or so ago focused on the contribution of voluntary collaborative measures as a part of a company's due diligence strategy. And Doro, I look forward to our next events, and hopefully events. The focus of today's event is on the implementation of the guiding principles. And 10 years ago, I think we have to agree that something extraordinarily important took place. States, businesses, and civil society came together to develop an internationally agreed framework on business and human rights, the UNGPs, the guiding principles. The UNGPs are a framework enshrining states' obligations to protect human rights, corporate responsibilities to respect human rights, and the need for appropriate and effective remedies when those rights are breached. ICC was closely involved in the elaboration of the UNGPs and supported their endorsement by the Human Rights Council. Over the past decade, ICC has actively supported its members to scale up business implementation of the UNGPs. We have also convened regional and thematic consultations, the first of which was in Latin America, led by ICC Mexico and ICC Argentina, to contribute business perspectives to the project led by Dante and the working group. And importantly, we recently launched a new initiative, the ICC Working Group on Business and Human Rights, to bring together member companies from our global network to share best practices and experiences, to discuss challenges and opportunities in the business and human rights agenda, and to contribute in a more regular way to the UNGP 10+ project. The working group, the ICC Working Group, looks forward to contributing to the implementation of the project's roadmap for the next decade that Dante mentioned, once it's been released later this year. We've also promoted greater implementation by governments by calling for the development of robust national action plans, but more work needs to be done here, and by all in the decade ahead. The UNGPs refer clearly to the need for a mix of measures, both voluntary initiatives and regulatory frameworks, to ensure implementation by states and businesses. This mix of measures must be developed in an internationally consistent manner, and in order to accelerate implementation of the UNGPs, this smart mix must deliver multi-stakeholder policy coherence and a level playing field for all companies, large or small. A number of leading businesses and business sectoral coalitions are actively supporting some sort of mandatory due diligence measures, with the objective that such measures would promote greater consistency, lead to a level playing field, and provide greater impact on the ground. However, many others, sometimes SMEs, have concerns such as the burden of additional regulatory requirements and the extent of liability. These measures must also, as I've said, result in a real impact on the ground. Earlier this week, in the presence of the United Nations Human Rights Council, ICC Vice Chair Maria Fernanda Garza reaffirmed the commitment of the International Chamber of Commerce to the UN Guiding Principles and to work with all stakeholders to deepen their implementation over the next decade. Looking towards the next decade, we must all place an absolute focus on policy interventions that can make an immediate difference in the real world, especially for the most vulnerable to human rights violations. This will require a variety of initiatives at different levels, underpinned by true openness and collaboration between the private sector, governments, and civil society. I believe there's a real opportunity for ICC, in the spirit of our centenary declaration that Thomas mentioned earlier, to lead the transformation process, and in collaboration with other stakeholders, understand the obstacles, develop the healthy and transparent policy frameworks required to address these challenges and to find solutions. ICC commits to maintaining its leadership role in developing and promoting the urgent advances that are required to implement more effectively the UNGPs in the next decade, and to deliver the sort of transformation that is required to address the key global challenges of inequality and sustainability. At the same time, we reiterate the call for greater business engagement and expertise in the discussions going forward. We've been celebrating during the course of this month 1 decade of the guiding principles, recognizing the progress that has been made and this time of systemic game changing. And I think Dante's mentioned that he's been involved in at least 15 events in the last couple of weeks. So congratulations, Dante, for your energy. But as you've said, it's a glass half full or glass half empty, however you see it. But we do, as you say, Dante, share the same glass. And our work as a society is clearly not done. We must focus on the next decade. And we continue to believe that, Dante, as you say, the glass, the framework, the UNGPs represent a transformational roadmap to a future where human beings and corporations alike can thrive and prosper. We urge all governments who have not done so to commence the development of robust action plans without delay, and when doing so, to engage with all stakeholders, including business. The ICC Global Network stands ready to contribute constructively to the elaboration of any new action plans, with the singular goal of ensuring that national frameworks enable meaningful action from the private sector at all levels. The challenge ahead is twofold: to ensure that these new practices translate into improved human rights performance, and to enable all businesses, regardless of size, sector, or location, to embed respect for human rights throughout their operations. And this will be especially true as new legal and policy approaches are developed and implemented. We also encourage the United Nations and its member states to enhance the efficacy of follow-up mechanisms under the guiding principles, to allow for enhanced sharing of best practices and to catalyze collaborative approaches to enduring challenges. We must now work together, all of us, business, governments, and stakeholders, all working together to take implementation to the next level, to make it exponential, as Dante has said, and also to have those conversations that are not always comfortable or can be awkward between stakeholders. We need to have these conversations if there is going to be progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Crispin. Thank you very much for your words. We are very pleased now to welcome Mrs. Isabel Gattiker, who is the co-founder and director of the International Film Festival and Forum on Human Rights, which is the leading international event for cinema and human rights. It's been taking place here in Geneva since 2003, parallel to the annual main session of the UN Human Rights Council in March. Mrs. Gattiker will focus tonight on the common threads which connect business, activism, and human rights advocacy. Isabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to hear all these great interventions. So as you mentioned it, Beatrice, I organize a film festival every year, and we'll go back to that. And I'm very happy to share today some thoughts on the topic of business, human rights as a member of the civil society. So we can go to the first slide. So we have a shared space. We are all connected. We live in a globalized planet, and we cannot think anymore that we can work alone in our own bubble. We all know that. We already knew that 15 months ago. And now the pandemic has really proven it to us. We can consider this pandemic, as an absolute and definitive case study that has shattered us to our core and proven us how we are really deeply interconnected. But yet, there's a growing paradox. What has this revealing pandemic created? It had created also a hunger for containment. Borders are closing, states try to rebuild their sovereignty and their power, and it has become increasingly difficult to have a global consensus on any topic. Even now, in 2021, more than ever, societies, companies, political parties, and activists are working in silos, really closed silos. So we live in a paradox of an interconnected yet contained world. And we live in a deep tension. It looks like an elastic that is going to break. How can we start together to release this deep tension? The answers are multiple, but I will just start to work with a consideration. For the moment, many of the calls of society are against. We are against wars, we are against poverty, fighting the virus. We're against so many things. But what are we in favor of? What do we want to achieve? What is the social contract we want to build together as a community? We really need to start working on our common goals and our common aspirations. Find common horizons that we want to work on together. And in order to find new common grounds, we really need to rethink what really unites us today. For instance, you and me, except the fact that we're human beings. What is the most common battle that we need to win together today? And I think it's the battle for human rights, the battle for social justice. I think that first and foremost, we all need to understand that the world has deeply changed and what it really means for us. Human rights are like the oxygen that we breathe. You won't feel it until you have a lack of it. Until a few years, we all thought, unconsciously sometimes, that everyone was agreeing on the fact that human rights, democracy, and freedom of expression, that was a common quest, and that we were going to win it. But it's not the case anymore. If human rights on the surface still are on the center of our conversation, it is less and less the case under this surface. I think here in Switzerland and in Geneva, we sometimes have this impression that we live in an island. Human rights are not an evidence anymore. There is a deep battle going on. Populist politicians and groups are using the media to disseminate messages that either pervert or openly reject the human rights principles. And they're doing it in a very clever way. In many countries, they're even dominating the debate. And right now, we must understand that populist politicians, populist authoritarians are winning this battle for our arts and our minds with divisive, xenophobic rhetoric that really dehumanizes vulnerable people. Attacks on human rights defenders are everywhere. Attacks on human rights activists. And what has shifted now? In 2021, we can say that until very recently, business was relying on others to implement human rights. They were relying first on the UN and key international institutions, but even if they're still very effective, and we're hearing it today too, these international institutions are still being undermined. Multilateralism is at stake. International justice mechanisms are also being undermined. Businesses were also relying on states, but states are less powerful, and taking a stand for human rights has become increasingly difficult for states in a context of migratory crisis, health crisis, security crisis, economical competition. And even in established democracies, freedom of expression, freedom of association and assembly, freedom of information, and the right to privacy are under increasing attack. Businesses were also relying on the civil society to defend human rights, but the trust given to the media is slumping, and meanwhile, the NGOs are slowly losing their power to mobilize as they live in a shrinking space in so many countries. So waiting for action from outside is not possible for businesses anymore. We can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, there it is. So the time is now for a responsible business to act and to really defend civic freedoms and protect human rights defenders. As I said it before, we are all interconnected. Today, much more than before, human rights advocates need the corporations and the business industry. And it's crucial to understand that it's not only a matter of image. It's not only because it's good for business. What I want to stretch today, it's also a matter of the future of our societies. Now, if we can agree on that, and I think we all agree on that today, and the question is how? How can we efficiently defend human rights together. That's my next slide. So we'll go back to the work I do. Since almost 20 years, we're organizing this film festival in Geneva, the International Film Festival and Forum on Human Rights. It's a unique place in the world. It's taking place, as Beatrice mentioned it, every year in March during the main session of the UN Human Rights Council. It's set in Geneva, the capital of human rights. And also Geneva is one of the only harbors for human rights defenders. So since 20 years, it has become really a unique platform. So we can go to the next slide, and there is a video here. There is a trailer of the festival, if you click on it. Does it work? No? Another window.
Well, I think this festival is so important because the stories that are told in the film and the message of the films are stories that need to be heard by people all over the world.
Thank you. So this festival has now become an international platform, and after 20 years, we're really starting to reflect on how an event like this can transform lives and advocate globally for human rights. So the question that I wanted to talk about today is, what can this festival and this model really teach us on the topic of business and human rights? And what I can reflect is different important points or ideas for the conversation today, I hope. So that's my next slide. So the first angle could be that we need to work efficiently by opening new places of debate. First, what the festival has taught us is that it's really important to have real open debates with real questions, tackling new subjects, but also debates involving activists too. You know, businesses are sometimes afraid to let the activists really talk with them, really go on stage, really let the activists criticize them. But activists are absolutely critical, both to exposing human rights abuses and also to craft solutions together. So really bringing local advocates into the equation ensures that those best placed to see these abuses taking place on the ground are also helping to develop relevant solutions. So really, we should not be afraid of critics, really. On the contrary, we all need to embrace them. The second thing that the festival has taught us on debate is that activists need not to overlook business. My second point, this point is that activists should also need to learn how to go on this debate. It's not only the case of businesses. New alliances are a really important way to go forward with human rights. As more governments turn hostile and embrace populist authoritarianism, we need to rethink who our allies are. And as a human rights community, we need to continue to hold business accountable for fueling human rights violations, of course, But we also need to understand that more and more corporate leaders are waking up to the benefits of promoting and defending human rights. So rather than rejecting the businesses and corporations, human rights activists really need to find new ways to work together and really influence both efforts. We really all need to learn to go beyond the naming and shaming and try to find new collaborative approaches. And the third point for the debates is that we also need to build a real public support for human rights. And that means changing the way we work and the way we all communicate. So on the activist side, anyone who has worked with an NGO knows that advocates love jargons, words, bullet points. And I think that's part of the reason we're having so much trouble cutting through the noise and getting the message of human rights across and winning this battle of human rights. So activists need to change the narrative around human rights with powerful stories. And on the business side, there is also a deep necessity of sincerity, going beyond the greenwashing, beyond going with just words, and really go through action. The fourth point is that we need to stop thinking in terms of borders. When we tackle the subject of business and human rights, we must create new links and foster new collaborations between groups. We need to have people coming together at the table from really remote corners of the world. And that's absolutely crucial if we want to advocate and foster real change. We need to also go on a real dialogue with people coming from different regions. We all need to stop this mistrust between advocates and businesses, between activists and corporations, and learn how to listen, really listen again. And my last form is that we also need to have a real debate, and a new way of debate is that we need to embrace new forms of activism. That is absolutely key. And there we go to the core of the festival and what we are learning while working with artists. As we know, it's a film festival in the beginning. And many people see human rights as something boring, primarily the purview of lawyers and legislation. But collaborating with artists and showing films and works of art really allows us to reach new audiences and really work with the feeling of empathy. And then the other angle that the festival taught us, and that's my next slide, is finding common grounds. To find common grounds, we need to efficiently back human rights defenders. Businesses should not only listen to, but also effectively back frontline human rights defenders by funding, by offering real protection, and not forgetting grassroots activists too. Grassroots activists are really the best people placed to solve the problems facing their communities. It's essential. Why? Basically for two reasons. One, because it's much more effective to invest in a community-driven social change than impose an agenda. And the second reason is that because companies can rely on the local knowledge, data, experience of human rights groups to really avoid and prevent inflicting harm on the communities affected by the work. So yes, it's also good for business. And the last advice and the last implementation that we learned for the festival is that we need to start with the local. We shouldn't forget that defending human rights should also be done here in Geneva on a local level. Companies and businesses should always be, when they can, involved in their community. And naturally, they should also hire people that are diverse. And again, listen to them. Really giving a voice, a power to women, to people coming from different countries, different cultures, can be also such a powerful way to defend human rights. This is more than a question of numbers. It's really understanding and assessing that, yes, we have a common ground. So that was a short talk, many topics, but I really hope it helps fostering a conversation. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me today, and also already having me as coming from the cinema world and the culture world is also a really good sign that we are all trying to find new ways of discussions and debates. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. We are very happy that you accepted our invitation to talk tonight. We'll now give the floor to Dorothee Baumann-Poli, who is a professor at Geneva University School of Economics and Management. She directs the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, which is the first human rights center at a business school in Europe. Since 2013, she is also the research director at the Stern Center for Business and Human Rights at New York University. Dorothee will explain to us why and how human rights should be implemented in corporate practice. Dorothee, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Beatrice, and thank you for inviting me to contribute to this event. I certainly concur with my fellow panelists. It's a good moment in time to reflect on the next decade of the UN Guiding Principles and discuss how to use the UN Guiding Principles as a catalyst for advancing human rights in corporate practice. I actually started teaching business human rights pretty much exactly 10 years ago. And one concrete observation that I would like to share with you right away is that teaching business human rights has become easier. In my courses today, I spend significantly less time on the question why companies should look into their human rights impacts than in my early days of teaching this subject. Students today actually no longer question the relevance of the topic, and they're eager to learn how to implement corporate human rights commitments. The same is true for my conversations with companies. I think for many companies, business human rights has reached issue maturity. This means it's no longer necessary to justify why we are discussing human rights in business. And given the developments over the past decade, and particularly, I would say, during the past months with the pandemic that highlighted the critical role of business for solving societal problems, it has become clear that respecting human rights in core business operations is important for both business and society. So today I have 10 minutes to discuss the why and the how with you. And in this spirit of a forward-looking agenda, I want to spend only a couple of minutes on the why. And then in the remainder of the time, I want to refer to some examples from our research that highlight how companies can approach human rights implementations. This is where the rubber hits the road, and this is where companies are still struggling. So next slide, please. At the Geneva Center, we educate future leaders and support companies in the development of business models that align profits and human rights principles. So we want companies to be successful, but successful while respecting human rights. In our research, we identify corporate approaches and tools to address human rights challenges, and our research reports provide practical recommendations. So I invite you to find more information about our work on our website, gcbhr.org. Next slide, please. So here I'm listing some of the business reasons why corporations engage in human rights, beyond the moral imperative to respect human rights that some executives also mention. First of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that companies today in a globalized economy operate in some of the toughest places in the world. Isabelle, I thought, did a great job highlighting the poor state of civic freedoms around the world. And with that come increasing governance gaps that today corporations are expected to address. Secondly, I think investors increasingly demand corporations to prove sustainable business models. Over almost one third of the world's global assets under management are under sustainable management, and investors request ESG data, environmental, social, governance aspects of a corporation, and human rights are part of the S in ESG. And by demanding ESG data, investors set strong incentives for corporations to also look into human rights. Also, apparently consumers increasingly want it. I have doubts about the many studies that have recently been come out that apparently proved that point. I believe there's still a gap between what consumers say and what they actually act upon. But there's growing evidence that there's a growing niche, at least, of consumers that specifically demand corporations to produce sustainable products, for example. I think an even stronger driver comes from within corporate organizations. Employees themselves ask about human rights in their own organizations. And I think in the war for talent in particular, it's important to prove how social responsibility is conducted, because the best talents want to work for corporations that respect human rights. And then last but not least, governments clearly started requiring the implementation of human rights due diligence, the core concept of the UN guiding principles, at least in some countries, in France, Germany, Norway. So there are soon also legal requirements to look into human rights impacts. And so taken together, these drivers for business human rights create a strong case for integrating human rights into daily business practice. But how do we translate this into action? Next slide, please, Beatrice. Let me now go on and just briefly show how companies can implement their commitment to human rights. Let me make 3 points from my perspective as a business school professor, leaving aside the important role that governments also need to play. At the company level, I think we need to develop business model innovations, business models that align profits and human rights principles, to be successful by showing respect for human rights. And we see some of these models emerging. In our research at the Geneva Center and at NYU, we have looked, for example, into core business operations to assess how they could become more compatible with companies' commitments in human rights. And we've done that, for example, of companies in the fashion industry. Fashion industry brands have mostly outsourced their production to suppliers in China, Bangladesh, Vietnam. And we found that the type of relationships they have with these suppliers can really make a difference for the implementation of labor rights. So we've identified 2 models, a transactional purchasing model and a relationship model. And we can show that the relationship model at least gives human rights a chance at those supplier facilities. Another example from our research is the cobalt supply chain. Cobalt is a critical battery mineral, and electric vehicles require cobalt for their batteries. So the human rights concerns in the cobalt supply chain are very urgent and timely, considering the fast growing demand for electric vehicles. Currently, over 2/3 of the world's cobalt originates in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where cobalt is often mined in small and informal mine sites, sometimes with the help of children and certainly under very poor safety conditions. Fatal accidents because tunnels collapse happen on a daily basis. Companies in need of cobalt can support the formalization of these sites. So to make an informal site more formal, this means that they're creating a control space for mining that is in line with international, for example, international health and safety standards. And in so doing, those downstream companies support the socioeconomic development of mining communities in the Congo and can create a win-win situation for the miners, for their own production, and of course also for the reputation of their downstream companies. At the industry level, and I'm happy that we're today speaking at this industry level at an industry association, and Dante earlier mentioned the critical role that industry associations play. It's clear that individual companies cannot do this alone. They need a level playing field. Dante has highlighted that too. And they need to work together with industry peers and other critical stakeholders to develop industry standards. I think we need both. We need soft standards and hard law. We need soft standards that can create rules of the road and a level playing field, common standards that also address the uncertainty that companies are currently facing when they are outsourcing production and supply chains, for example. But they're complements and necessary complements, I believe, to the emerging hard law requirements in the form of mandatory human rights due diligence. So my third point to conclude, let me also say a word about the role of my own institutions and business schools around the world. We think they absolutely need to contribute to the next decade of action of the UN Guiding Principles. And it's clear to me that business school education needs to adapt and start teaching 21st century leadership skills. This means they have to make greater efforts to bridge between theory and corporate practice. To this end, we have created a network of business schools that pool knowledge and resources, and we've published this toolkit. You can see the title page on the slide to put together our collective knowledge. And we've done this to lay the foundation for a future that has human rights in business built into the DNA of companies. After all, business schools educate future leaders. So also business schools have a critical role to play to advance action on the UN Guiding Principles. Thank you. I look forward to many questions.
Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you very much. We are very pleased now to welcome our last but not least speaker, Peter Nestor. Peter is head of human rights at Novartis. He joined Novartis in 2019 after 8 years in the human rights practice at BSR, which is a non-profit organization advising companies on human rights. Peter is also leading projects to investigate pharmaceutical supply chains, develop human rights training, and deliver webinars. He will share with us tonight his practical experience of designing a workable human rights due diligence program. Thank you very much, Peter, for being with us tonight, and we're looking forward to listening to you.
All right, thank you very much, Beatrice, and really a pleasure to be here. I have to start with a warning that this presentation will probably not be nearly as inspiring as Dante, Crispin, Isabel, and Dorothy. It's a really tough panel to follow, but what I want to try to provide here is really a nuts and bolts, on the ground, in the trenches, working inside of a company view of what human rights due diligence can look like, especially now that we have 10 years of case studies and experience that we can learn from watching others in this field. So let me focus my comments on the slides that I've prepared on the approach that we've taken at Novartis. I hope that for those companies that might be joining, wondering what human rights due diligence is or how to actually implement the guiding principles, I hope that this might inspire some ideas, and I would welcome any conversation and questions as we get into the Q&A. Just before we get started, I should mention Novartis is a pharmaceutical company, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. We have a broad portfolio of medicine that we deliver around the world in a number of different capacities. We work in over 150 countries. So some of those markets that Dorothy referred to as being some, the toughest to work in, we are certainly there. And so human rights around the world is really critical for our company and really critical to get it right. So let me start with a basic commitment, which any company that's working on business and human rights 10 years after the guiding principles have been established should be committed to fully implementing the UNGPs in practice. Some people might have noted the recent passage of human rights due diligence laws in Germany, in Norway, the proposed law in the EU. Several of these laws incorporate the UNGPs, and so it's a safe bet that if you're committed to implementing the UNGPs in the right way, that you will also be setting yourself up or your company up for compliance with the emerging legislation here. So our anchor commitment is to the guiding principles. If we want to go on to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about how we did the first step here, which is to figure out what are the most relevant human rights issues for our company. In the parlance of business and human rights, these are called salient human rights issues, or the most relevant human rights areas. They should be identified through a process of both internal engagement with a number of different internal stakeholders and external engagement with experts and with rights holders who are impacted or potentially impacted by the company's operations. For us, these are the 12 areas that we have come up with. won't go into too much detail on all of them. Some of them are specific to the pharmaceutical industry. You'll see clinical trials on here, access to medicine. Other areas are relevant or consistent across almost any company. Respect for labor rights, health and safety, bribery and corruption. You'll also see number 8 over here to, I think it was Dante's point earlier, about the consistency between companies and their lobbying practices. We are planning to take a look at that a little bit closer from a human rights standpoint going forward. I think what's also helpful to point out here is that oftentimes for a lot of companies, the most salient issues or the most relevant issues will be ones that are already known or are already managed. So I'm actually in the process of reorganizing this list slightly to bring a little bit more focus into those areas where we don't necessarily have good human rights processes or policies in place, and sort of ticking the box on things like health and safety, for example, where, you know, in the pharmaceutical industry, we're heavily regulated. Health and safety, or number 10 here, quality and counterfeit medicine. This is something that the company has been doing for a long time and doesn't necessarily need a human rights expert to come in and provide guidance. In the short term, our time and resources are better spent shoring up some of the other issue areas. So I think there are some different ways that you can organize these salient issues. The great thing about the guiding principles is that there's no right or wrong answer usually. There's a lot of different flavors and ways to do it. This is the way that we have identified our salient issues. If we could move on to the next slide, I'll talk about how we unpack the guiding principles. And when we look at our commitment and we say we're committed to the guiding principles, to implementing the guiding principles, what exactly does that mean? And what you'll see on this slide is the structure that we have established in terms of organizing our commitment to the guiding principles. One thing I've learned working in business for the last couple of years is that businesses are really good at counting things and really good at measuring things, and human rights and the human rights program should be no different. I have found that the more that you can attach specific numbers, metrics, the better buy-in you get, and the more clear it is what value exactly you're adding to the company beyond just doing the right thing or beyond just complying with the guiding principles. And you can start to show your progress over time. This, for us, hopefully will become externally available and something that we'll be reporting on a regular basis. But I think it's important to design a program that you can measure. I should note that the numbers here are hypothetical. I changed them. These are not the actual numbers for Novartis or for any other company. These are just hypothetical to give you a sense of how we do it. But let me take a minute here just to explain kind of the 3 pillars that we've identified and the 9 elements that we are tracking. So the first is under due diligence. This is probably where the most important work for us, at least in the early days of building and understanding exactly how our program is going to work. This is where we spend a lot of our time. 3 things we're looking at here: conducting risk assessments and impact assessments from a human rights perspective and using a human rights-based approach. This requires stakeholder and rights holder engagement. It requires looking at the risk or the impact from the rights holder's perspective. And it requires conducting severity analysis and likelihood analysis that is consistent with a human rights-based approach. The second then is to take a look at our policies and make sure that where we might have policy gaps or where we might not have a policy at all, we need to fix those policies and close those gaps to make sure that we have the right commitments in place that we can then hold ourselves accountable to. We can, of course, measure that. How many policies have we looked at? How many policies have we fixed? And we can slowly turn that dial until we get to 100%. Those policies are not going to do anything on their own. They need a management system. They need implementation. They need systems in the business to do that. We have a very small team. Most other companies also have a small team. So we're reliant on a lot of other people to implement those systems. This is where we need to go in and look at business processes, make sure that, especially things like, where grievances are raised or problems are identified, that remedy is available and is something that people who are running that system or in charge of that system actually understand and can implement. When we look at empowerment pillar, this is where we're looking at both empowering rights holders through our grievance mechanism, and again, conducting a gap analysis there and measuring how close we are with the effectiveness criteria in the UN guiding principles. We also then need to do both targeted training for our employees, for people who are sitting in high-risk markets or in high-risk functions, but also some broader awareness raising so that people can get inspired to care about human rights and to ask difficult questions about what the company might be doing in particular areas that we don't necessarily know about on our small team. The last area then is on external engagement. And this one we've broken into 3 elements. One is on collective action, which is a really critical part of the guiding principles when it comes to using or increasing leverage, especially when you're dealing with problems in the supply chain. We've been able to undertake some collective action programs and have a number of those now lined up through our industry association, one of our industry associations, the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative. Stakeholder engagement, both rights holder engagement, but also stakeholder engagement, talking with expert NGOs and other civil society members, some of the groups that Isabel mentioned in her sort of inspirational call for more inclusivity and more engagement with NGOs is a critical part of implementing the guiding principles. And again, something that we can track and measure. And then finally is external reporting and making sure that we are telling our story. Let me close with bringing these 2 areas together. If we could advance to the final slide, it really sets up nicely where you can put together a chart and take a look at, there's a lot of data here. I'm not going to go through every piece of this. And again, all of the indicators here have been changed. So this is not a reflection of where we're at on Novartis on these issues, but just for illustrative purposes, you can see, you line up the salient issues coming down the left-hand side, and then you've got the 9 implementation elements for the UNGPs across the top, and you can very easily go through and say, all right, this is where we are set from a human rights standpoint, UNGP standpoint. This is where we are working, where we've got some progress, where we're doing an assessment, we're engaging with rights holders or internal stakeholders, or where we have a gap and where we need to focus. And this then allows you to build a strategy, which you can then start to implement through various initiatives and projects, one piece at a time. I'll close by saying that I was inspired 10 years ago when the guiding principles were adopted, but it was always clear that it was a journey, that no company was going to come up to speed on human rights overnight. It's been very inspiring to be in this space and watch this field grow over the last decade. And it's obviously a great pleasure to be here today and to work with Novartis and help us along our journey, implementing and making sure that we're turning all of our check marks to green ones as we're implementing our program. So very happy to take questions as we go into the Q&A. Beatrice, back to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Yes, we have a little more than 15 minutes left for questions, answers, and discussions. Dear participants, you can write your questions in the Q&A box. And if you wish to ask your questions, if you wish to speak, then just raise your hands, please. We had a reaction to Isabel Gattiker's speech, saying, what about proactive corporates led human rights initiatives? Corporate social responsibility is not just about being on the receiving end of the promotion of human rights, but equally on the proactive end. Sometimes governments need to be held accountable by businesses. What good practices in this regard? One example is MasterCard and PayPal's refusal to work with Pornhub, while the Canadian government did nothing.
That's a really good question, and it's absolutely true, but I think it's the Dorothée that should answer it, as she's the specialist on the topic. I'm not.
Chris Parr raised his hand, so I'll pass that on. Thank you.
Thank you. If we're passing the potato, maybe I'll pass it to someone, the hot potato to someone else. But actually, I wanted to respond to a question that was asked to me, so perhaps I can do that. I think it was Christian Pauletti. It seems to have disappeared from the chat now. But if I remember correctly, he was asking me what governments could do to support businesses in their efforts. So I'm sure Dante has a response to that as well. But I think that the main thing is, and this has been actually one of the topics discussed in the newly created ICC working group on business and human rights that I mentioned is a tendency towards the privatization of human rights. And I guess that's being raised by businesses, not by people like me in business associations. So companies that are out in the field who are feeling that they don't have support of governments in some of the countries where they're operating or investing. And by that, I mean the frameworks that are required don't exist. So the companies have to make it up themselves. And as Peter mentioned, many of the companies operating in these environments have committed to the guiding principles, so they do want to do the right thing. But the governments are not necessarily there to accompany them and to support them. So the frameworks, I guess, national frameworks, national action plans, but not just plans on paper, plans that are implemented, and engagement. I think we've talked a lot about consultative mechanisms, engagement with stakeholders. So I think that would be my answer to Christian's question. But look, I think, Dante, you probably have some views on, what are the major obstacles of implementing the guiding principles on the business side as well. So perhaps I can pass, as we're passing the floor, perhaps I can pass on to you to see if you have any additional comments, and also what you see, not just in relation to governments, but also what are the main obstacles to businesses implementing the UNGPs.
Yeah, sure. And thank you for that. Well, one thing is that I would agree with you on the first part regarding the level playing field requires an enabling environment, and that enabling environment in many places of the world doesn't exist or is weak. And you can, again, have two sides of the same coin to describe the situation. Some business will say that is a problem because we don't have a rule of law and we cannot trust the government and it's not predictable and therefore it's very difficult to do business. Others will say, that's great because I can do whatever I want. Let's say, well, the light went off here. And I can pretty much do whatever I want. And in my context, Latin America, corruption is very high. So let's say we don't lack volunteers to engage with corrupt governments and to find a way in how to do business in a non-transparent manner. So let's say, but certainly we need a level playing field, and we have the rules. They exist, but we need to make them work actually everywhere. But to you and let's say that is a challenge that we're trying to face and try to solve, but it's taking us some time and some effort. And we need collective action from governments that are ahead of the curve, enlightened, jointly with business that are also doing the same thing. We're having conversations with business regarding conflict zones or areas where there is very complicated situations in Asia, for example, with military coup or with prosecution to minorities, etc. And we're able to have an honest conversation, but with no easy solution. And one thing that you just asked about challenges in business. I'm part of the World Business, World Economic Forum working group on the Future Council on Business on Human Rights. And one conversation there, which is very, very clear, and it's a consensus conversation, is that the number one obstacle for the business and human rights agenda to actually move faster is the governance structure of our own companies. Governance boards that are way too homogenic, form and educated in the same format and with the same business model, let's say, mindset, where differences in terms of background, experience, knowledge, vision is practically inexistent. And therefore, without bad intentions, the capacity to make decisions that are innovative and that look after solutions in the medium long term is very low. And that is something that has been said by the newly appointed head of the MIT Media Lab, who was the former second in charge of NASA. And what she said is that what drives innovation and good intelligent solutions is diversity in all directions. And that is something that we certainly lack at the decision-making level of business. And if we look at the composition of our boards, this is a report that WEF is going to publish, actually. The composition of the board is a very good predictor of the capacity to innovate and to look after solutions, looking into a future that requires sustainability. So that will be, let's say, my take on that angle. And since I work in a business school, one thing that I can bring in, and I would like to comment a little bit on what Doro presented. Today is the 20th anniversary of the center that I'm director of. We have been doing training on sustainability management for 17 years now. And my students have changed from public relations, 90%, to engineers, 50%. And of course, many of them are the head of sustainability of subsidiaries. They are not headquarter head of sustainability, they are subsidiary head of sustainability, and that explains why they are disproportionately today engineering and how to operationalize market incentives or government obligations or business commitments. But that is remarkable because that was not the case 20 years ago, not even 10 years ago. And today is a very, very strong message of who's leading. And who's leading also are female. 70% of my students are women, which also signals where the leadership and the innovation comes from, and who are the drivers for the future, which I certainly welcome because really we have a very lively discussion in class, now virtual, but certainly that is where innovation and passion is and where the driving forces are. So again, thanks. And I will go and turn on the lights because it's very creepy to be, let's say, in a dark room right now. So I will come back in a second.
Thank you very much, Dante. We have a question for Dorothy asking, when speaking of HHDD in the fashion industry, has there been research on the marketing rather than supply end of these companies' role in human rights? Is there a need to re-evaluate the messaging towards children who have become the main consumers, who are increasingly younger and whose bodies are increasingly sexualized? At a time when Me Too incest has revealed an average 20% children are victims of sexual abuse, isn't this the new HHDD?
Thanks, Vera. That's a great question. I agree that we're currently very much focused on human rights risks of manufacturing companies in the supply chain, often focused on labor rights, but I couldn't agree more with you that there are also issues downstream. And you mentioned one with fashion brands engaging in marketing campaigns that are misogynist or are making vulnerable groups like children even more vulnerable. So I agree, if a company conducts human rights due diligence, it has to happen at all levels, upstream, downstream, and in all their functions, in sourcing, in marketing, in human resources, in design. It should become part of their DNA for how to do things in all operations. And sadly, a lot of companies still have specialized human rights or CSR departments that sit a bit on the sideline of the actual action and the core business. And for those departments to figure out how to infiltrate themselves into all operational levels and all operational functions, I think it's a big task. But this is what these people need to do as organizational intrapreneurs to make sure that the human rights lens truly applies to everything they do. But maybe Peter wants to say more about this. That's after all his job, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I think you captured it there, just in terms of I guess the point would be specifically on this question about fashion companies, marketing companies. I think your question here, Vera, might even go to online media companies, Facebook, Instagram, who are maybe inadvertently promoting these types of images or these messages, and that any kind of legitimate, robust human rights due diligence should capture this issue. And then you go back to the guiding principles and you look at, all right, what are we responsible for here? Are we contributing to this problem? And then what can we actually do as a designer of clotheswear, as a marketer of clotheswear, as a media company that might be showcasing these issues? All of that falls squarely within the ambit of human rights issues and should be picked up by anybody working on human rights due diligence within those companies. But yeah, it is tricky. These departments, CSR or human rights, are often small inside companies. A lot of people are fighting hard to get some bandwidth, get some airtime, get up on the agenda. And so oftentimes it helps to have outside campaigns raising these issues for us that are also working on the inside.
Thank you very
Clearly,
much.
I mean, I'm being asked to leave, huh? Because the light went off again.
Well, we have 5 minutes to go, so we still have time for questions, and I'm sure you can answer even if you're in the dark. Would there be any other question, maybe from you, from our speakers to each other? Take the opportunity to be together to discuss another points that you would like to raise, maybe.
Can I throw one question for which is we need to go global, and in a country like Switzerland, despite being small, is headquarter of a lot of huge companies, and it's also a big market in this, let's say in the commodity sector, and some other sectors also. Yeah, so and we have this challenge to go from good intentions or even good practices at headquarter level to a global landscape. How to do that, and how to combine efforts and how to create synergies and how to do that in practice, because we struggle basically. And I get asked several times, so, you know, how are we going to do this, and how are we going to address this challenges of this magnitude, and who's going to do it, etc. So I just would like a little bit of brainstorming on how to go global and to basically reach everywhere in the world in a cost-effective way, in a realistic way, but at the same time going into the let's say from incremental to exponential, which is where we need to go during the next 10 years.
May I offer one thought on this? So after all, this is an event with the International Chamber of Commerce. So I think we are at the right place to globalize this topic. And I'm looking at Christian to back me up here. But I believe, you know, if industry associations could take this on and define human rights due diligence industry by industry, because the human rights challenges are so different for companies that operate either in tech or in manufacturing or in the security context. So if we could define concrete industry-specific human rights standards industry by industry, and industry associations would promote these and require these and set effective level playing fields for all their members, I think then we would make exponential progress towards the implementation of human rights globally.
Yeah, no, I agree, Dorothy, and I look forward to, as I said in my remarks, our next event, so we can start the process. But I also said in my remarks that I think there is an opportunity for ICC to play or to continue to play a leadership role, but equally to make that role more dynamic, exponentially, as we're planning to do in relation to implementation. We have the networks. Our current Secretary General is building those networks in places where we have been not so strong in the past, in some parts of the world. So I think, you know, Dante and other colleagues on this call and participants, that's a challenge for us in the next decade. There is the mandatory due diligence that's being talked about, the smart mix, the voluntary collaborative measures that we've talked about, with colleagues, which can play a role. And in some areas, some regions, there's a lot of awareness raising to do, which Dante, you and I have talked about. So I think there's probably a multi-pronged strategy that we need to work on, depending on the region, and working with all stakeholders. So that's I'm very happy on behalf of ICC to take up that challenge for the next decade and work with many of you.
Crispin, a small hint. We're going to be proposing a building blocks approach. They're so different speed, different places, different sectors, different governments, overall in the same direction, but it doesn't have to be everyone on the same pace at the same moment, etc. So to avoid excess of anxiety, but at the same time stimulate improvement. So the building blocks, and we're piggybacking on the narrative of the Dutch government regarding their action plan on business and human rights.
Great. Now so you knew the answer to your question, Dante. Just teasing you. But I think that certainly as the European Union develops its own policies around human rights due diligence, they will be very active. And we've heard a number of policymakers from the European Union talking about this already, using various policy mechanisms within their armory to assist, whether it's through their aid program or whatever. So I think there'll be a lot of people for us to partner with. And I look forward to that, to hearing more about that building blocks approach too, Dante. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much to all for your answers and comments. It's time to end the webinar. The CCIG will make sure to contribute as much as possible. So if there is any question from the participants, if you wish to liaise directly with one of the speakers, just let us know and we'll be glad to connect you with them. Vincent, I can see that you're back. Would you like to close the webinar, say a few words?
I would certainly be delighted, and I'm in the midst of a voting process here at the Parliament, but I've been listening to you carefully and I'd like to thank you all for your most valuable involvement on this very critical and sensitive topic. And you can count on the Geneva Chamber to pursue its achievements in this respect in cooperation with you here from Geneva, the home to the human rights. Thank you so much and have a safe summer.
Thank you and have a very nice evening to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.